She hadn't shaped a single word in what felt like a lifetime, so when the maid's cracked whisper reached him, Ronan Marsh nearly didn't trust his own ears. He was the kind of man other men lowered their voices around, a boss whose name moved money and shut doors across half the harbor city, and he was 3 steps from the armored car that carried him everywhere when a thin hand caught his sleeve and pulled. "Quiet. Follow me," that was all she said. This pale young woman named Adeline, who cleaned his floors and folded his linens and drifted through his mansion like she'd trained herself to be invisible. Her gray eyes always lowered, her chapped hands always busy, a faded scar along one wrist, and something in her face that looked far too worn for a woman, not yet 30. He should have brushed her off. Powerful men don't rearrange their mornings because a servant tugs their coat, but there was a terror in her voice so raw, so long buried, that it froze him where he stood on his own drive, and against every instinct that had kept him alive, he let her draw him, behind the tall stone planter spilling over with red geraniums, down out of sight of the gate. Out there in the honeyed light of the fading afternoon, a stone's throw away, his driver stood waiting beside the black car, one hand resting easy on the door handle, everything exactly as it ought to be. The same suit, the same build, the same shaved head catching the last of the sun. Except Ronan's real driver, a loyal man who'd shielded his life for years without fail, never once slipped off the scratched steel watch his dead brother had left him, and the man at the gate wore nothing on his wrist at all. Adeline turned her palm up between them, and there, scrawled in smudged ink across her own skin, were 3 words that tilted the ground beneath a man who feared almost nothing. "They mean to kill you." She couldn't say it aloud, couldn't force out all of it, so she pressed a trembling finger to her lips and mouthed the rest, her eyes pleading with him to grasp what it had cost her simply to make a sound, because the last time this woman had cried out for help in the dark, no one had come, and she'd worn her silence like a sentence ever since. Now she was breaking it for a man the whole coast feared, a man she had every reason to flee from, and Ronan Marsh crouched behind those blossoms with his heart hammering in his ears, staring at a stranger wearing his driver's face, and felt the whole careful, dangerous shape of his life begin to splinter apart. Before we go on, if a story about the quietest soul in the room turning out to be the bravest speaks to you, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs it today, and subscribe so the next story finds its way to you. Now let's return to that driveway, to the whisper that changed everything, and uncover what this silent woman knew that could bring an entire empire to its knees. Ronan never took his eyes off the man standing at the gate. Through the narrow gaps between the geranium bushes, he studied him the same way he had always studied the men seated across from him at a negotiating table, not by looking at the face, but by looking at the things a face could never fully hide. And the longer he watched, the more clearly he saw. The man stood too straight, his shoulders drawn tight like a soldier's, not like a driver accustomed to long stretches of waiting. His feet didn't shift with the weary carelessness of someone trapped in a dull job. They moved by inches, deliberately, as though he were guarding a particular line of sight, and his hand, the one resting lightly on the car door handle, would tighten and release in the rhythm of a man counting the passing seconds. Raph had never stood that way. Raph stood like an old stone that had rested beside this sea for 100 years, with nothing to wait for and nothing to fear. Ronan lowered himself a little farther and guided Adeline down with a gentle touch to her shoulder, and in that moment, he realized the body beneath his hand was trembling violently, trembling like the last leaf of autumn still fighting to hold on to its branch. He turned to look at her. This woman had just risked both her life and the small livelihood that kept her fed to drag him away from a car, and now she sat curled in on herself among the leaves, her face drained white, her breathing short and ragged, yet those gray eyes never left him. There was something strangely unwavering in them, as though every last fragment of courage left from an entire lifetime had been gathered into that single gaze. "How did you know about this?" he asked, lowering his voice until it was barely enough for the two of them. "How did you know they were coming for me?" Adeline swallowed hard. Her throat moved, her lips parted, and for 1 second Ronan thought she would force out another sound, but this time only breath escaped, dry and hollow, like wind passing through a house where no one lived anymore. The few words she had spoken earlier seemed to have taken everything her throat had left to give. She pressed her lips together, and he saw shame flare painfully in her eyes, the shame of someone betrayed by her own body at the very moment she needed it most. Then she slipped a hand into the pocket of her faded apron and pulled out a pencil worn down to a stub and a piece of paper folded into quarters, the kind of lined paper torn from a school notebook. She spread it across her knee, and that calloused hand began to write, shaking but never stopping, each slanted word chasing the next across the page as though she feared that if she slowed for even 1 second, her courage would run dry. Ronan waited. In his world, waiting was a luxury he rarely granted anyone, but now he waited in silence, patient and still, while behind them the engine of the black car continued to hum beyond the gate like the breathing of a beast lying in ambush. She handed him the paper. The writing was crooked but clear, every word pressed into the page with all the strength she possessed. Last night I saw them. I know what they said. They mentioned your name. Please don't go back to that car. Ronan read the lines again and again, and there was something in the way she had written them, something in the words "please don't," shaped with far greater care than everything else, that tightened his chest in a way money and power had never taught him how to name. He had lived among vows of loyalty purchased with fear, among lowered heads paid for with money, and he had learned very early that in his world, no one gave anything without expecting something in return. Yet this woman, a woman he couldn't even remember ever having looked directly in the eyes, was risking everything she had, little as it was, simply so that a powerful stranger might live one more day. She asked for nothing, she begged for nothing for herself. She had only written, "Please don't go back to that car." At the gate, the imposter pulled out his phone. He lowered his head to the screen, his thumb moving quickly, then lifted his gaze toward the house once more, holding it there longer than before. Time was running out. Someone on the other end was asking why the prey still hadn't stepped into the trap. Ronan folded the paper and slipped it into the inner pocket of his vest, close against his chest. Then he looked at Adeline, looked directly into the gray eyes raised toward him as they waited for the fate of them both, and he did the one thing this entire harbor city would never have believed if anyone had lived to tell it. He placed his trust, the one thing he had never fully given to any living soul, into the calloused hands of a maid who couldn't speak the words aloud. "I believe you," he said softly, and for the first time in many years, her eyes didn't lower. Ronan knew he had very little time left before the man outside the gate lost his patience, but he knew something else as well, that he couldn't act until he understood what he was facing. "Tell me," he said softly, his eyes still fixed on the gate through the gap in the leaves. "Tell me everything you saw last night, from the beginning. Don't leave anything out," Adeline nodded. She turned the paper over, and the pencil stub began moving across the lined page again. This time she wrote more slowly, more carefully, like someone retracing every step along the road of her own memory. Last night, she wrote, she had gone outside to take out the trash later than usual, because she had needed to finish cleaning the grand dining room after the mistress's small gathering. The trash bins stood behind the row of storage buildings at the far end of the garden, where the lights from the mansion couldn't reach, and on her way back she had seen light spilling through the frosted window of the old storage room, the murky yellow glow of a desk lamp in a place that should have been completely dark at that hour. She stopped writing and looked up at Ronan, as though to make sure he was still following, then continued. She had meant to walk straight past. Servants in houses like this learned very early that there were doors they shouldn't look through and questions they shouldn't ask. But then she recognized one of the two voices behind the glass. Though the words were muffled into indistinct sounds, it carried a rhythm she had heard for months inside this house, the slow, gentle, never-hurried cadence of Mr. Sloane, the advisor who smiled at everyone and meant it with no one. Ronan felt his jaw tighten, but he said nothing. He only gave her a slight nod to keep writing. She couldn't hear anything through the thick glass, she wrote, but she didn't need to. Then her hand hovered over the page for a long moment, as though what she was about to reveal was a secret she had guarded all her life, before the letters appeared again, unsteady but unmistakably clear. Since losing her voice, she had learned how to watch other people speak. Lips, tongue, jaw, even the movement of a person's throat, all of it became language to her. People believed her world was silent, but in truth it was overflowing with words no one realized they were exposing. And, last night, through that frosted glass, beneath the murky yellow light of the desk lamp, She had stood hidden in the darkness and read every word from Sloane's lips as though she were reading from an open book. Ronan looked at the small woman before him and understood, for the first time, the chilling irony of fate, that the mastermind had taken precautions against every listening ear in the mansion, had chosen the most distant storage room, had lowered his voice behind thick glass. Yet he could never have imagined that the very silence life had forced upon a maid would become the only weapon capable of piercing every layer of his defense. "What did he say?" Ronan asked, his voice so low it was almost nothing but breath. The pencil moved again. He said everything had to look like an ordinary morning. He said the man behind the wheel had been replaced and no one would notice. He said all you had to do was get into the car, and the rest would take care of itself, and after today there would be no one left standing in the way. Adeline stopped, her fingers tightening around the pencil stub until they turned white. Then she added one final line, slowly, one word at a time. The other person, the one Sloane was speaking to, had her back turned toward the window, so Adeline couldn't read what she said, but she saw blonde hair falling over her shoulders, and she saw Sloane reach out once and touch that hair in a way no one ever touched a stranger. Ronan closed his eyes for the span of a single breath. Blonde hair. There was only one woman in this mansion with hair like that, and she wished him good night every evening. He didn't allow himself to fully believe it, not yet, but the cold spreading from the center of his chest didn't need his permission. "Was there anything else?" he asked, and Adeline nodded, searching for the last empty space on the paper. This morning, when she entered Sloane's study to clean it as she did every day, she had seen a printed map of roads on his desk beneath a stack of files he hadn't put away. She didn't understand all of it, but she recognized the harbor route, recognized the drawing of the tunnel his car always passed through, on the way down to the docks, and over that section of tunnel was a circle drawn in red ink, dark and heavy, as though whoever had marked it had traced over it again and again. Ronan opened his eyes. Outside the gate, the imposter had just lifted the phone to his ear, his lips moving as he said something, and Ronan suddenly realized a truth that sent ice down his spine, that if this woman could read lips from that distance in the darkness of night, then what was the man standing there in broad daylight about to tell his accomplices? He turned toward Adeline and saw that she, too, was staring at the gate, her gray eyes narrowed, reading. Then all the color drained from her face, and for the second time that afternoon, her hand clutched tightly at his sleeve. "What is he saying?" Ronan asked, and Adeline stopped writing. There was no time to write anymore. She only stared through the narrow gap in the leaves toward the gate, her lips moving as she silently repeated every word her eyes were gathering. Then her fingers began to sign, slowly and clearly, pointing at him, and then at her own lips. He just said, "Your name." She raised one hand, opened it, then closed it again to signal waiting, before slicing that same hand sharply through the air. He said the target still hasn't come out. He said he'll wait a little longer. Then he spoke a phrase Adeline had to write down, because she was afraid signing it might make Ronan misunderstand. 3 slanted words appeared in the last empty corner of the page. "When the job is done, the full payment will come through, and everyone disappears from the city." Ronan read those 3 words and felt them weigh more than every threat he'd ever received in his life, because the men who had threatened him before had always wanted him to know, wanted him to be afraid, but these men wanted him never to have the chance to know anything at all. He had risen from the salt, fog-soaked docks of this port city, from the days when he was nothing more than a hired laborer, with only 2 strong hands and a cold, calculating mind. He had learned the rules of the underworld through his own flesh and blood, and he had built an empire in which every container crossing the docks knew his name. Every river of money flowing through the harbor left a share for him, and he had held on to all of it for so many years, not because he was more brutal than the men around him, but because of one rule he had never broken. Don't touch the innocent. Don't touch women or children, and never, never turn your back on your own people. It was because of that rule that many men in the shadows called him weak, and it was because of that same rule that those who followed him to the end. But rules couldn't stop a knife driven into a man's back, and now, crouched behind a flower planter on the grounds of his own home, he was counting in his mind how many people were close enough to know his schedule, close enough to replace his driver, close enough to map the route he traveled every week, and the list was short enough to chill him to the bone. Adeline suddenly touched his arm lightly. She was looking at him with a new hesitation, as though there were something she had meant to keep to herself, but her conscience wouldn't allow it. Then she turned the sheet of paper over, found a narrow strip of space along the edge, and squeezed in several lines of tiny handwriting. "There's one more thing. There used to be a kitchen assistant in the house who often worked the evening shift. Last week, she whispered to me that she saw Mr. Sloane meeting a stranger outside the side gate late at night, and that she intended to tell the master of the house. 2 days later, they said she had suddenly quit and gone back to the country." Adeline paused, and when she continued writing, her handwriting shook far more visibly, but she never said goodbye to me. Her belongings are still in her room. The coat she loved most is still hanging behind the door. No one leaves the coat they love most behind. Ronan read those lines twice, and the cold that had settled in the center of his chest spread all the way down into his hands. He understood this language. He had lived long enough in the underworld to know that no one there suddenly quit a job, people only disappeared, and men who could make someone vanish that cleanly, without noise, without a trace, while even managing to invent a story about her going home to silence every question, weren't reckless amateurs working for money. This was the hand of someone skilled, organized, and patient. Someone with the patience of a spider that had been spinning its web long before the prey ever realized it was walking into a trap. And what chilled him most wasn't the conspiracy against him, but the thought that the woman sitting beside him, holding a schoolchild's sheet of paper and a pencil worn down almost to nothing, now possessed the exact kind of secret that had already made another person disappear. If she hadn't tugged on his sleeve that afternoon, then perhaps, in a few days, they would also say that the mute maid had suddenly quit and gone back to the country, and there wouldn't be a single person in the world who thought to ask one question. He looked at her, at the narrow shoulders struggling not to tremble, and something he had believed lost to him long ago rose inside his chest. It wasn't the rage of a crime lord betrayed. It was something far more primal, the instinct of a man standing before a living soul who had risked herself for him and was now standing in the line of fire in his place. "Listen to me," he said, slowly and clearly, giving weight to every word. "From this moment on, you're not alone anymore. I swear to you, on everything I have, no one will touch you or anyone you love for as long as I'm still breathing." Adeline's gray eyes widened, and Ronan saw something in them that made his heart sink. She wasn't looking at him as though he were a savior. She was looking at him like someone who had grown far too familiar with the way even the most beautiful promises eventually dissolved into smoke. Beyond the gate, the imposter slipped his phone into the inside pocket of his coat, and for the first time since the beginning of the afternoon, he stepped away from his place beside the car door and began walking slowly toward the house. The imposter was advancing toward the house, which meant their hiding place behind the flower planter would remain safe for only a few dozen more heartbeats. Ronan grasped Adeline's wrist and motioned, with his eyes toward the side of the house, where a narrow path between the stone wall and the row of ornamental shrubs curved around to the back garden, and the two of them moved, low and swift, keeping close to the shadow cast by the wall beneath an evening sky that was darkening into the color of aged copper. Ronan knew this house as intimately as he knew the palm of his own hand. He had commissioned every wall, had stood watching as each tree was planted. Yet now, crouching and slipping through his own garden like a thief, he found everything suddenly unfamiliar, as though the house had quietly changed owners without his ever knowing. They passed the low windows of the small sitting room on the west side, and Ronan had meant to glide past them as he had every other window. But then, a flicker of pale gold inside stopped him in the middle of a step. Through the sheer curtain that had been drawn only halfway closed, within the warm pool of light cast by the floor lamp in the corner, Celeste was standing there. His fiancée was still wearing the cream silk dress she had worn that morning when she kissed his cheek and told him to come home early for dinner. Her golden hair still fell over her shoulders in the same style that had once made him, a man who believed himself immune to every soft and tender thing in the world, feel his heart stir the very first time he saw her. And facing her, standing so close that their breaths might have touched, was Sloane. Ronan watched the advisor raise his hand, not in a professional handshake, not in the polite gesture of an employee toward the future mistress of the house, but with fingers that gently swept a strand of golden hair behind her ear, Slowly, familiarly, naturally, as though he had done it 1,000 times before. And Celeste didn't step away. She lifted her face to receive the touch like a flower accustomed to being watered every afternoon. Her lips moved, and though a pane of glass stood between them, though Ronan didn't possess Adeline's eyes for reading words, he still heard her, because Celeste's voice had always been clear and carrying, and because fate could sometimes be cruel enough to let a man hear with perfect clarity the one sentence he should never have had to hear. Just a little longer, my love. Once we get word that it's finished, I'll pour the wine. We'll raise our glasses and bid him farewell, and then this entire port city will belong to us. She spoke those words in the same voice that had whispered goodnight to him through countless evenings, the same voice that had trembled when she said yes, as he knelt before her, with a ring beneath the bougainvillea trellis on the veranda, and Sloane bent down and pressed a lingering kiss to her forehead with the calm assurance of a man who believed he had already won. Ronan didn't move. He had imagined this moment ever since Adeline wrote the words golden hair. He had told himself he was prepared, yet when it truly came, he understood that no one could ever prepare for something like this. Strangely, what descended upon him wasn't rage. Rage was something he knew how to use. Rage was a weapon, a flame that could be forged into a blade, but what was happening inside his chest didn't burn. It collapsed, silently and completely, like a house whose foundations had been hollowed out from within, while its facade remained untouched, standing for one final moment before falling into the emptiness beneath itself. He had spent half his life in a world where betrayal was an ordinary thing. Enemies had set traps for him, partners had broken their word, men under his command had sold him out, and he had survived it all because of one belief, that no matter how many swords and spears waited outside, there would still be a place behind the doors of his own home where his heart could remove its armor. It turned out that the deepest blade never came from an enemy. It came from the hand you had once held, from the shoulder where you had once rested your head, from the familiar face whose very rhythm of breathing and sleep you knew by heart. An enemy could kill only the body, but betrayal by someone beloved killed something far deeper. It killed the part of a man that still knew how to believe in the shelter of a home. A featherlight touch at his elbow brought him back. Adeline was looking at him, and in those gray eyes there was neither curiosity nor pity, only the quiet understanding of someone who had also once watched her entire world collapse without being able to cry out. Then she gently shook her head, a small but unmistakable gesture. Don't look anymore. They aren't worth letting your heart break for them again. Ronan drew in one long, measured breath, and when he released it, the man standing there had once again become Ronan Marsh of the docks, dry-eyed, jaw clenched, alive. He turned away from the illuminated window without looking back even once, and followed Adeline deeper into the gathering shadows of evening. While somewhere behind them the front doorbell began to ring, the impostor had reached the steps, and with every lingering chime, the time they had left to escape this place was running out. In the sheltering shadows of the back garden, Ronan turned to Adeline and spoke in the low, measured voice of a man accustomed to making life or death decisions in the space of a heartbeat, a voice that left no room for hesitation. Listen carefully, because we don't have time for me to say this twice. You're going back into the house through the kitchen door, and you're going to do exactly what you do every afternoon. Clean, fold the towels, keep your eyes lowered, stay invisible the way you've always been invisible. Don't change even the smallest habit, because every pair of eyes in that house belongs to them now, and anyone who disappears from their post at this moment is writing their own name on a page they've already marked in red ink. Adeline's gray eyes trembled, and he saw that what frightened her wasn't what might happen to her, so he continued before she could even reach for the pencil. Your sister will be taken to the safest place in this city tonight. My people will handle it, the people I trust with my life. She'll be cared for properly, and she won't know that anything is happening. To her, it'll only be a little vacation where someone reads her a story every night. But you have to stay, and I hate having to say this, but staying is how you survive. Running now is what will get you killed. Adeline looked at him for a long moment, then nodded, slowly and squarely, and in that instant Ronan understood that this small woman possessed more courage than half the tattooed men who had once sworn to live and die under his command. She slipped through the hedges and disappeared down the path leading to the kitchen door, and Ronan drew out his phone and pressed the name of the man he trusted most in the world. It rang twice. "Raf, listen and don't ask questions. You're at home, aren't you?" The voice on the other end went still for a beat before answering that he was, that the company had sent word telling him to take the entire week off, because the boss was using an outside car service, that he had found it strange and had almost called to ask, but he hadn't wanted to bother him. Ronan closed his eyes. The final piece slid into exactly the place where it belonged. That message had never come from the company. "There's no vacation, Raf. Someone used my name to push you away from me. Pick up the 2 men you trust most. Go to the hospital where my housemaid's younger sister is staying, and take the girl and 1 caregiver to the house by the bay. Which, take the long way around. Don't tell anyone. And Raf, from this moment on, don't trust any message unless you hear it in my own voice." He ended the call and made a second one to Bishop Cole, the old advisor who had stood behind him since the days when Ronan hadn't even owned a decent car, and he said only 3 things. There was a traitor at the highest level. Don't use any familiar line of communication. Meet me where we drank our first glass together. Bishop would understand. Then Ronan put the phone away, straightened the lapels of his jacket, drew 1 long breath, and stepped out from the garden shadows to do the most reckless thing imaginable, walk openly through the jaws of the trap waiting for him. He circled around to the front entrance and descended the steps with his usual unhurried stride, his eyes fixed on the screen of his phone, like a busy man who saw nothing beyond his work, and he felt the imposter's gaze sharpen when the target finally appeared. The man straightened beside the car door, 1 hand settling on the handle, every muscle in his body saying the same thing. "It's almost over." 10 steps, 7. Then, neither fast nor slow, without lifting his head, Ronan shifted his path by the smallest degree, just enough to pass behind the car instead of approaching the rear door, raised the phone to his ear, and spoke loudly enough to be heard in the indifferent tone of a man discussing business. "Yes, I'm outside." "Wait, something's wrong with the car, I think." "Forget it. I'll walk over to where you are. It's close." Then he kept moving toward the smaller pedestrian gate, passing so near the imposter that he could smell the cheap tobacco clinging to the man's coat. The driver faltered, his mouth opening as he tried to call after him. "Sir, the car," but Ronan only waved 1 hand to show that he was busy on the phone, and the pedestrian gate closed behind him with a soft, ordinary click. The imposter remained rooted beside the vehicle. There wasn't a single page in the script inside his head explaining what to do when the target decided to walk. He fumbled for his phone and began dialing, never knowing that at the other end of the line, the man who had hired him was receiving the bad news in a silence cold enough to raise the hair on the back of his neck. Nor could he know what Sloane had decided, before the assignment had ever been given, that whether the plan succeeded or failed, the man behind the wheel that afternoon, the only outsider who had seen all their faces, wouldn't survive the weekend, because to spiders like Sloane, every strand of silk that had served its purpose had to be cut. Ronan Marsh, meanwhile, turned onto the narrow street behind the estate, slipped into the evening crowd heading home from work, and vanished from his own world like a drop of water falling into the sea. The refuge Ronan chose was a small attic above an old laundromat in the harbor district, a property registered in the name of a dead man, whom neither the underworld nor any official record could ever trace back to him. A place where the scent of soap and warm steam from the floor below seeped through the wooden boards, while the steady turning of the dryers sounded like the heartbeat of some gentle creature. After nightfall, Raf sent word using the old code the 2 men had shared for years. The little bird had returned safely to the nest, which meant Adeline's younger sister was secure in the house by the bay with her caregiver, and exactly as Ronan had arranged, Adeline stopped there on her way home from visiting the girl, a brief visit that fit perfectly into her habit of seeing her sister every evening, so no watchful eye inside the mansion could notice anything unusual. She climbed the narrow wooden staircase, still dressed in her servant's uniform, and when she sat in the chair across from him beneath the single desk lamp, Ronan suddenly realized something that left even him momentarily stunned. For the first time in all the months she had worked beneath his roof, he was truly looking at her. Not glancing past her the way people glanced at a piece of furniture that happened to move, not giving her the appraising look of a master inspecting a servant, but looking, truly looking, at another human being. and what he saw made something inside his chest sink. He saw old calluses on hands that were still far too young, saw the collar of her uniform, where it had been carefully mended with thread almost the same color as the fabric, saw the worn heels of her canvas shoes kept strangely clean, all the quiet traces of a life that had never been allowed the luxury of weakness. He had lived among velvet and silk for so long that he had forgotten there were people who had to stitch every seam back together just to preserve the last small measure of dignity they possessed. And those people passed through his life every day, pouring his coffee, pressing his shirts, invisible. "Your sister," he said, his voice gentler than even he had expected. "How is she?" Adeline placed the small notebook he had given her that afternoon on the table, replacing the scraps of paper she had been forced to use, and the pencil began moving again, this time without trembling. "She's all right. She thinks she's on vacation. She's very happy." Adeline hesitated, then added another line. "She's waiting until she gets completely well. The doctor says her heart needs surgery, and we're waiting." Waiting. She wrote the word calmly, without complaint or explanation. But Ronan had lived long enough to know how many sleepless nights could hide behind a word written with such quiet restraint, and he didn't ask anything more, because some doors had to be opened by the person standing behind them, and no one else had the right to force them wide. Instead, he asked another question, the one that had been lodged in his chest since that afternoon. "Why, Adeline? You didn't owe me anything. You could have closed your eyes and looked the other way like everyone else, safe and invisible. Why did you risk everything for me?" Adeline looked at him for a long time. Then, instead of reaching for the pencil, she slipped one hand into the pocket of the apron folded neatly inside the basket she had brought with her and drew out a sheet of paper worn at all four corners, folded into quarters so carefully that the creases had grown soft as cloth. She opened it on the table beneath the pool of yellow light, and Ronan saw a picture drawn in colored pencil, the innocent, uneven strokes of a child's hand. Two people stood holding hands in front of a house with a crooked chimney. The taller figure had brown hair shaded in with great care, while the smaller one wore a smile that stretched almost from ear to ear, and above them hung an enormous sun with rays drawn so long they seemed to be reaching down to embrace them both. In one corner of the picture was a crooked line of childish handwriting. "Addie and me. Someday we'll have a home." Adeline gently touched the smaller smiling figure with one fingertip, then picked up the pencil and began writing each word slowly, as though she had spent the entire afternoon thinking about her answer. "A long time ago, there was someone who needed to be saved, and I couldn't save them because no one would listen to me, and because I didn't keep trying until the end. I carry that with me like a stone inside my body. This afternoon, when I knew you were about to get into that car, I could think of only one thing. If I stayed silent one more time, that stone would crush whatever was left of me, and I would never be able to look at this picture again. She believes I am her protector, a good sister. I'm only trying to live in a way that doesn't betray the child who drew this picture." Ronan Marsh sat motionless for a very long time. The man who had bought nearly everything in the world with money and fear now sat before a sheet of paper with worn corners and a line of childish handwriting, feeling something tighten in his throat that even the deadliest nights on the docks had never made him endure. He looked at the picture, at the little house with the crooked chimney that the two sisters had never possessed, then at the woman sitting before him, and he said softly, almost to himself, "All my life, people have been loyal to me because they were afraid or because I paid them. But you nearly died for me because of a promise you made to the child who drew this sun. Adeline, you're making me learn all over again what it means to be human." Adeline left the attic before every light along the street had come on. Returning to the mansion at the same hour she always came home after visiting her sister each evening, and near midnight, in the back room of a small tavern hidden down a stone alley, where two men had once raised their first glasses together, back when neither of them had been anyone at all, Ronan met Bishop Cole. The old man sat there with his familiar silver hair combed straight back, wearing the same worn wool coat he stubbornly refused to replace, even though he had enough money to buy the entire tailor shop, his deep-set eyes having witnessed every kind of storm this port city could summon. And beside him sat a trim woman with cropped hair and a calm face that revealed nothing, June Calloway, the finest information hunter Ronan's money had ever been able to hire, a woman who had uncovered secrets that had defeated both the police and the underworld. Ronan told them everything, briefly and coldly, in the same voice he used when reporting a shipment lost at sea, about the car, the imposter, the warehouse, Sloane, the golden hair beside the window, and the kitchen assistant who had suddenly vanished. Bishop listened without interrupting once, his fingers interlaced on the tabletop tightening with every passing moment, and when Ronan finished, the old man spoke softly, his voice roughened by emotion, saying that he had watched the young dock laborer, from all those years ago, grow into the man sitting before him, that what Celeste had done hurt him as though his own son had been betrayed, and that now they needed to follow the thread backward and discover who Sloane had been before he became Sloane. June nodded, opened her leather notebook, and began asking the questions of her profession. Who had access to Ronan's schedule? Who knew the route down to the docks? Who had the authority to send orders to the driver in the company's name? And it was there, amid answers that seemed like mere procedure, that the entire table began to tilt beneath them. Ronan's schedule, detailed down to every hour, and clearly already in the hands of whoever had planned the attack, existed in only 3 places: inside his own mind, inside Sloane's private system, and inside the leather briefcase that never left Bishop Cole's possession. June stated this in the flat, emotionless voice of a woman who followed evidence rather than affection, then placed a printed sheet on the table, a record from the vehicle dispatch system that she had managed to extract before someone erased the trail. And there, the false order granting Raph a week of leave had been sent from a device logged in under the identification code belonging to Bishop's office. The room fell silent as the bottom of the sea. Bishop looked at the paper, then at Ronan, and for one moment that seemed as long as their entire lifetime of loyalty, the 2 men simply stared at each other, one carrying a question he couldn't bear to speak, the other wearing the shock of a man who had just seen his own name engraved on the blade. "Ronan," the old man said, each word slow and heavy, "I held you in my arms when your mother was still alive. I stood beside you on the night you nearly lost everything. If you're going to ask me that question now, ask it plainly. I won't be angry, but I want you to look into my eyes while you do it." And Ronan looked into those eyes, the eyes that had taught him how to read contracts, how to read men, how to read even silence itself. And what he saw there wasn't the fear of someone exposed, but the pain of someone doubted. Yet he had also learned that very afternoon that the most familiar faces could conceal the most unimaginable truths, and that lesson was still bleeding inside him. "I'm not asking," Ronan said at last, his voice hoarse, "but I can't choose not to know either. You understand me. From now until the truth comes out, don't blame me if there are things I don't tell you." The old man nodded slowly, and that nod hurt more than any accusation could have. June closed her notebook and said the identification code might have been stolen, that she needed time to trace the real device, and that, until then, the wisest course was to narrow the circle of people who knew Ronan was still alive and thinking clearly. They counted that circle on their fingers. Raph and the 2 men closest to him were guarding the house by the bay, quick-witted Pike, who watched over warehouse number 3 and whom Ronan had once saved from a debt that would have been paid in blood, Quiet Harmon, who managed the loading crews with a face that never changed, and Colm, Bishop's distant nephew, whom the old man himself had brought into the organization when the boy was still running messages, clever, capable, and absolutely discreet. The names passed across the table like cards laid face down, and no one in that room that night, not even June with eyes that missed almost nothing, realized that one of those cards had been replaced by another hand long ago. Ronan rose. Exhaustion settled deep into his bones, and as he pulled on his coat, he suddenly understood the cruelest irony of the night. In the entire empire he had built from blood and steel, among vows of loyalty and debts of gratitude piled as high as mountains, the only person he could now trust without a single second of hesitation was a mute maid standing alone inside the tiger's den. The following afternoon, June returned to the attic above the laundromat with the darkened eyes of someone who hadn't slept and set a thick dossier on the table, heavy as a gravestone. She said this should have taken weeks, but fate had offered her a shortcut. Years earlier, while investigating for another client in a southern city, she had photographed the face of a young advisor standing at the edge of a grand underworld funeral. At the time, his face had been nothing more than an irrelevant detail in an old file. But the night before, Acting on instinct as she searched through that stack of yellowing photographs, she had found him, younger, thinner, carrying an entirely different name, standing exactly 3 steps from the dead crime lord's coffin, in the place reserved for a member of the family. Sloan isn't his real name, June said, spreading the photographs beneath the pool of lamplight. And you aren't the first. The story she told afterward seemed to lower the temperature in the small attic 1 degree at a time. In the southern city, he had once served as the right hand of a powerful dock boss who died when his boat sank in what was officially ruled an accident, and only a few seasons later, the entire territory fell into the hands of a new alliance negotiated by that same advisor, before he vanished with an enormous share of the dead man's fortune. In a mountain town farther west, he appeared under yet another name, worked his way into the inner circle of an influential trafficker, and that man burned to death inside his own warehouse with the doors locked from the outside. The case was closed with 2 words, electrical fault, while the advisor disappeared again at precisely the right moment, richer, quieter, and more polished than before. The same hand, June said, placing 3 photographs side by side, 3 faces with 3 different hairstyles and 3 different names, but the same patient eyes of a creature that hunted at night, the same method. He never attacks from the outside. He asks for a position. He serves. He makes himself indispensable. He studies his target from within, the habits, the roots, the weaknesses, the trusted people. Then he plants his own men into every joint and bone of the organization. When everything is ready, he arranges an accident so clean that no court can touch it, manages the funeral, manages the transfer of power, and manages his own disappearance. Ronan stared at the 3 photographs for a long time, and what chilled him wasn't Sloane's past, but the reflection it cast back upon him, because the man had stood beside him, had poured his wine, had held the pen and signed countless documents on his behalf. Then June turned to the next page of the file, and for the first time, her voice softened. As for your fiancé, she explained that Celeste hadn't entered Ronan's life, by chance as he had always believed. The charity gala where they met had been arranged with meticulous care. The guest list had been manipulated, and the person who introduced them had been a paid link in the chain. Behind her stood the hand of the Northern Syndicate, men who had coveted Ronan's docks for years, but knew that a direct attack would bring only a bloody war they might not win, so they had chosen Sloane's path, the path that ran through the target's heart. This was never the story of an unfaithful woman who made a reckless mistake and plotted to kill her husband, June said, and in that moment, the ground beneath the entire story seemed to turn. The romance was only the paint on the surface. This is a takeover, Mr. Marsh. Planned before you had ever heard the name Celeste, complete with ledgers, money flows, and planted personnel. They don't want to steal a woman from you. They want to steal your entire empire, and the woman was merely the key they forged especially for the lock that was you. Ronan sat motionless, and inside his chest, the pain of betrayal began transforming into something else, something colder, clearer, and far more dangerous, because a man might collapse beneath the weight of a broken heart, but a crime lord couldn't allow himself to fall while the enemy was aiming at everyone who lived beneath his protection. And the kitchen assistant, he asked, his voice dropping low. The woman who disappeared. June drew out the final sheet, a copy of a missing person report obtained through a source inside law enforcement, accompanied by a photograph of a marshy stretch along the lower bay, where a woman without identification had washed ashore the previous week. Her file remained at the city morgue beneath the words unidentified female, and the details recorded in the report, her build, estimated age, and the crooked tooth on the left side of her smile, matched with chilling precision the cheerful kitchen assistant Adeline had described. She meant to tell you, June said quietly. And they found out. The attic sank into silence, with only the dryers turning steadily below them, like the heartbeat of an innocent world that knew nothing of what had happened. Ronan closed his eyes, and he saw the coat still hanging behind the door, the most precious possession an honest woman hadn't lived long enough to take with her. Then he opened his eyes, and the betrayed man from the previous afternoon was gone. There was only ice. Then beginning tonight, he said, every word falling like a stone, we're no longer defending ourselves. She died because she tried to tell me the truth. Adeline is living every hour inside the tiger's den because of that same truth. I won't bury another innocent person, June. Now it's their turn to learn what it feels like to be hunted. Of all the orders Ronan gave that night, there was one he didn't tell June, didn't tell Bishop, and didn't tell anyone except Raph. And he gave Raph only one instruction: keep it quiet, and under no circumstances let her know it came from me. Early the next morning, at the house by the bay, a renowned cardiologist whose name appeared only at major medical conferences arrived in an unmarked car, accompanied by a small team and several cases of gleaming equipment, to examine the little girl who sat by the window overlooking the water, completely absorbed in her coloring. She simply thought that this vacation house took especially good care of children, and she giggled when the doctor let her listen to her own heart through the silver stethoscope because it tickled. That afternoon, the caregiver sent Adeline the usual daily message, telling her that the little girl had finished all her porridge, that a very kind doctor had come to examine her, and that he had said the operation the sisters had been waiting for so long had finally been arranged discreetly at one of the finest private medical facilities in the region. Every expense had already been covered in full, and they only needed to wait until the child was strong enough for the procedure. The only explanation anyone offered was that it was a special benefit for the relatives of employees. That night, following the rhythm they had carefully established, Adeline stopped at the attic above the laundromat on her way home from visiting her sister, while Ronan left his hiding place under the explanation he had already planted within the trusted circle, that he was meeting a source near the night market. The moment she reached the top of the wooden stairs, he knew she had discovered the truth, because she didn't sit in the chair as she usually did. She stood motionless in the middle of the room, clutching the small notebook in both hands, her gray eyes fixed on him with a question too large for any paper or pencil to contain. She set the notebook on the table and opened it to a page she had prepared earlier, the handwriting more unsteady than usual. A benefit for employees' relatives. I have cleaned that mansion long enough to know no such benefit has ever existed. It was you, wasn't it? Why? Ronan didn't answer immediately. He poured her a glass of warm water and placed it in her hands. And the moment those calloused fingers closed around the glass, he saw them begin to tremble. Then her narrow shoulders trembled too, and the woman who had remained standing through so many storms suddenly broke apart before him without making a sound. She wept the way she had lived, in absolute silence, tears streaming down her colorless face, her shoulders jerking with sobs that could never escape her throat, and that silence made the sight more heartbreaking than any wail Ronan had ever heard, because he suddenly understood that even grief and gratitude, the most natural things that could pour from a human heart, were emotions fate had forced this woman to swallow whole. She picked up the pencil and wrote through the curtain of tears, the words blurring beneath them. We have nothing to give you in return. I can't accept this. This kindness is too great. It would take my whole life. Ronan gently placed his hand over the page, stopping the sentence before she could finish it. Don't write the word repay, he said, his voice low and measured, because this isn't a debt, and please don't think it's pity either, because you are the last person in this world who needs anyone's pity. You want to know why? Then I'll tell you something I have never told anyone. All my life, everything I have done has carried a price. I helped a man to purchase his loyalty. I spared another to collect a debt later. I signed a charity check to clean the stain from my name. In more than 30 years of living, I have never managed to do a single decent thing without calculation attached to it, not once. And I grew so accustomed to that truth that I came to believe human beings were simply born that way. Then you tugged on my sleeve behind that flower planter, not for money, not because you owed me anything, not because you were afraid, but because of a picture of a son and a promise you made to a child. You gave me the first thing I have ever received in my life without having to pay a price for it. So last night, for the first time, I wanted to try doing what you did. I wanted to do one good thing and keep it hidden, to ask for nothing in return, to let no one know, simply to discover what it felt like to be a decent human being. He paused, and the faintest smile, weary but genuine, passed across his hardened face. It turns out it feels better than any deal I have ever won. So if you insist on calling it a debt, then think of it as a debt I am paying to myself, a debt for all the years I have lived without ever truly being kind. As for your sister, she will recover. She will run and play, and she will draw many more sons. This world owes children like her that much, and this time I intend to collect. Adeline looked at him through her tears for a long while, Then she did something that belonged to no page in any notebook. She placed her calloused hand over the back of his, only for a moment, as lightly as a leaf coming to rest. And in that small attic filled with the scent of soap, the man whose voice could summon fire across the entire port city sat utterly still, afraid to move, as though even one breath drawn too deeply might cause the moment to disappear. The following night, Raph's car rolled through the iron gates of the estate, and Ronan Marsh returned to his home like a man coming back from 2 busy days of work, his tie loosened just enough, an overnight case in hand, his face carrying the exact expression of pleasant exhaustion, worn by someone who had just closed a successful deal, because he understood the game he was about to enter, that from this moment on every blink of his eyes would be read, every breath weighed, and his performance couldn't afford to miss even a single beat. Celeste came meet him on the front steps, flawlessly beautiful in a wine-colored dress, and she wrapped her arms around him with precisely the right amount of pressure for a bride-to-be who had spent 2 days sick with worry, her voice pouring into his ear as sweet as honey, saying she had called and he hadn't answered, that she had nearly fallen ill when she heard about the unfamiliar car, that she wanted to know where he had gone and why he had vanished without a word. Ronan kissed her forehead, a kiss he had practiced in front of a mirror until it looked exactly like all the kisses that had come before, and he told her the story he and June had polished from every angle, that he had realized the vehicle wasn't one of the company's usual cars, that when he called dispatch they had stumbled through vague answers, and because he happened to be carrying a large sum of money for a land deal in the South that very day, he had chosen caution, left through the side gate, then decided to travel straight south and remain there for 2 days until the contract was settled. While his phone had failed and disappeared beneath a mountain of paperwork, and he was sorry he had frightened her, the story was perfect because it was harmless. It turned that afternoon into the accidental suspicion of a man carrying a great deal of money, never brushing against the conspiracy, never mentioning the false driver, never mentioning anyone inside the house, and Ronan watched it enter Celeste's eyes, watched her weigh it and turn it over like a jeweler studying a stone whose authenticity she couldn't yet trust. She smiled, gently scolded him for not sending even one message, and drew him inside to eat the dinner she said the kitchen had reheated. Throughout the meal, she was the very image of attentiveness, serving him the dishes he liked and recounting small household matters, but Ronan, who had spent a lifetime reading faces across negotiation tables, noticed the hairline fractures beneath that perfect glaze, the way her gaze rested on him longer than necessary whenever he lowered his eyes to his plate, the questions that appeared casual but were cast like nets. Which road had he taken home? Had he stopped anywhere? Had he seen anyone? And he answered them all with carefully rehearsed ease, while from the corner of the dining room Adeline quietly poured water, cleared the table, and remained invisible as she did every evening. The two of them didn't exchange a single glance, and the perfection of her performance made his chest feel warm and painfully tight at once. Late that night, after Ronan had gone upstairs claiming exhaustion from the trip, Celeste moved quietly down the corridor toward the small study at the end of the west wing, where Sloane was waiting with 2 glasses of wine already poured. She didn't touch hers. She stood beside the window with her arms crossed, her voice sharpening into something entirely unlike the sweetness she had offered at dinner, and said she couldn't swallow his story, that men carrying money might be cautious, but no man was cautious enough to disappear for 2 days without a single call, that she could smell something wrong, that perhaps he already knew. Sloane took a sip of wine, unhurried as though they were discussing the weather, then spoke to her in the calm, even voice that had lulled so many targets into sleep, saying that if Ronan Marsh knew even part of the truth, neither of them would be sitting there drinking wine, they would be lying at the bottom of the bay, that his return, his kiss, his dinner, and his going upstairs to sleep were the strongest proof that he knew nothing, that Sloane had personally examined every link in the chain after the mistake that afternoon, that the reckless, obvious driver had been removed from the board forever, without a trace and without a tongue left to speak, that every opening had been sealed with the finest mortar in the world, silence, and there wouldn't be another next time, because the matter would be finished, neat and clean, that weekend, on the very road to the docks that the target couldn't avoid taking. Celeste remained silent for a long while, her fingers tapping lightly against the window frame. Then she said, "All right," but there was still one thing. Someone inside the house must have seen or heard something that day. No one outside the household knew his exact schedule well enough to warn him, and if there was an informant beneath that roof, she wanted to find them. Sloane nodded slowly and told her to keep watching, but not to act too soon, because killing the chicken now would only make the fox wary. Once the larger matter was finished, they could deal with whichever servant they pleased. Celeste gave a faint nod, her gaze drifting through the window and across the dark courtyard, where light from the kitchen still cast a narrow golden strip. And within that light stood the faint, slender figure of the mute maid wiping the last drops of water from the stone counter, diligent, head bowed, harmless, and Celeste's eyes lingered on that figure for one heartbeat longer than they should have, only one heartbeat. But in this world, a single heartbeat was sometimes the boundary between life and death. In the days that followed, the seaside mansion became a stage where every performer wore a mask, and the person wearing the thinnest mask was the smallest among them. Adeline sensed the change before she could fully see it, with the instinct sharpened in her by years spent living beneath other people's roofs. The air around her thickened a little more each day. Conversations among the servants stopped the moment she entered the kitchen, then resumed behind her in whispers. The housekeeper suddenly began asking about her schedule with greater care than usual, and above all, there was Celeste, who had once never wasted even half a glance on a mute maid, but now appeared far too often in the places where Adeline worked for it to be coincidence, leaning against a doorway with a teacup in hand, watching every movement of her cleaning with eyes as beautiful and cold as two pieces of colored glass. Once, she even asked in a voice sweet as sugar and sharp as a knife, "You've worked here for quite a long time now, haven't you? You probably know this house even better than I do, even the places no one else bothers to visit." Adeline merely lowered her head, her hands never stopping, her face holding the same gentle, uncomprehending expression of someone who couldn't understand the hidden meaning. But at night, lying in her small room in the servants' quarters and listening to her own heartbeat, she knew the net was drawing tighter around her with every passing day. What she didn't know was that the net had already formed its first 2 knots, because in the study in the West Wing, Celeste sat before a computer screen, replaying the footage from the security camera mounted on the roof of the garage. The only camera angle left after Sloane had disabled the cameras surrounding the warehouse on that fateful night to erase his own trail. At the edge of the grainy frame, beneath the weak glow of the courtyard lamp, a slender figure carrying a bag of trash walked toward the far end of the garden at an hour when no one should have been there, stopped for longer than someone merely taking out garbage would need to, then returned. The face couldn't be seen clearly, but that shape, that narrow body with its bowed head, belonged to only one person in the mansion. And as though fate itself intended to tighten another knot, Sloane brought Celeste the second piece of evidence. In a rare moment of irritation, he told her that he always arranged the papers on his desk in a personal order precise down to the smallest angle, a professional habit of a man who lived by secrets. And on the morning after the night at the warehouse, the files on his desk had been shifted by a fraction from that exact arrangement. The difference had been so slight that he had dismissed it, assuming his memory had failed him, but now, when placed beside the figure in the camera footage, and the fact that the target had escaped the trap the very next afternoon, that tiny discrepancy became a red thread, and the only person permitted to enter and clean his study each morning was the mute maid. Celeste sat motionless before the screen for a long time, then said softly, almost with regret, "So it was that girl, that silent little shadow. Who would have guessed?" Sloane repeated his rule in the same even voice. "Don't touch her yet. She's mute. She can't tell anyone anything quickly. Keep her where we can see her. Once the matter is finished this weekend, we'll make her disappear as quietly as the kitchen assistant." But for the first time, Celeste didn't obey him completely. She summoned the new security man, a broad figure with a face that looked carved from gray stone, whom Sloane had brought in at the beginning of the year, and ordered him to keep eyes on the maid from that moment forward, at all times, wherever she went, even on the evenings when she left the estate to visit her sister. But the underworld of this port city had depths even Sloane hadn't reached, and from the very night Ronan declared that the hunt had begun, An invisible circle had quietly closed around Adeline without anyone realizing it. The man selling roasted chestnuts on the corner she passed each evening was one of Raph's former soldiers. The couple who often sat on the bench opposite the streetcar stop where she waited belonged to June. The paint-chipped taxi that sometimes appeared to be idling carelessly at the bottom of the hill near the servants' quarters had never carried another passenger. And when the stone-faced guard began following that slender shadow through the evening streets, he had no idea that he too was walking beneath the eyes of hunters far more skilled than he was, every step he took being reported to the attic above the laundromat almost as it happened. That night, after reading Raph's message that someone was following her, but everything remained under control, Ronan stood for a long time beside the small window, overlooking the street wet with reflected lights, his hands tightening into fists and then slowly opening again, because he understood the cruel position in which he stood. Pulling her out of the mansion now would tear the entire performance apart and force everyone into a war before they were ready. But leaving her there meant allowing his heart to walk every day between the blades of a pair of shears slowly closing around her. And for the first time in his life, Ronan Marsh, a man who had never known fear for himself, tasted the full bitterness of fearing for someone else, the kind of fear that kept a person awake through the night, and he whispered into the darkness like a vow, "Hold on. Just a few more days. I swear I won't let them touch you." As the night of the weekend drew near, during a visit to the attic above the laundromat that both of them understood might be the last before the hour of decision, Ronan noticed that Adeline was different from every other time. She sat beneath the pool of yellow light for a long while without opening the notebook, her calloused fingers rubbing again and again across the leather cover, like someone standing before a door that had been locked for too many years, wondering whether she still possessed the strength to open it. At last, she opened the notebook and wrote a line that left Ronan silent. "You once asked why I risked my life for you. I gave you only half the answer. Tonight, I want you to know the rest, so that if anything happens to me, there will be at least one person in this world who understands me completely." Then, beneath the lamplight of the attic filled with the scent of soap, the turning pages carried them back to a winter long ago, when Adeline was still a brown-haired little girl, living with her mother in a cramped rented room at the end of a poor apartment block on the outskirts of the city. Her mother worked late hours and had a weak heart. The two of them had nothing in the world except each other and one small ritual. Every night, her mother would sing one line of an old lullaby, and the little girl would sing the next, taking turns until sleep finally won. And the child Adeline had been talked constantly, sang constantly, her bright voice ringing through the hallways so clearly that the neighbors called her the little sparrow of the building. Then came that winter night, the night when Adeline's handwriting began to tremble beneath the pencil. Her mother suddenly fell ill in the middle of the night, her fragile heart finally surrendering after struggling for far too long, and in the room where only the two of them lived, with no telephone, the mother had only enough strength to grasp her daughter's hand and whisper for her to run and find an adult to help. The little girl ran barefoot across the freezing hallway floor, pounding on one door after another, screaming with every bit of breath in her small lungs, begging someone to save her mother, begging them to open the door, begging them please. But the doors of that poor building, where everyone had grown too exhausted by other people's troubles, remained tightly shut. A few lights came on and then went dark again. Someone shouted through a wall for the child to stop making noise in the middle of the night, and still the little girl ran, still she called, down the hallway that seemed endless, down the dark stairs, out into the deserted street, her voice breaking, growing hoarse, until nothing remained but white breath dissolving into the cold night air. And when someone finally stopped to listen to her, when adult footsteps finally followed her back to the little room, her mother was already gone, lying peacefully on the narrow bed, one hand still open toward the doorway, as though waiting for the sound of her little sparrow flying home. People said the child stood looking at her mother for a long time, without crying, and from that day forward, she never spoke again. The doctors said there was nothing wrong with her throat, that her vocal cords were perfectly healthy. What had closed wasn't in her throat, but somewhere much deeper. The women at the home, where she was taken afterward, said that on certain nights they saw her lips moving through the old lullaby, without a single sound emerging, as though her voice had gone away with her mother. Adeline wrote, the words gradually blurring beneath the tears falling onto the page. I called with my entire life that night, Mr. Marsh, and the world didn't answer, so some part of me decided that if the most desperate cry of my life had been useless, then all words were useless, that I no longer deserved to speak because I had called, and still couldn't save my mother. I wore silence the way a prisoner wears a sentence, year after year, until that afternoon behind the flower planter, when I saw you about to walk toward death without knowing it, and suddenly I understood something I wish I had understood a lifetime sooner. I didn't fail that night because I called. I only lost because the doors didn't open. The cry was never the sin. Silence was. So I called to you with the little bit of voice still left in the sparrow I had once been, not only to save you, but also to save the child who had been screaming inside me in that winter hallway all those years, to tell her that this time someone heard, this time the door opened, and she could finally stop running. By the time Ronan reached the final line, he could no longer continue reading. The man of steel and harbor docks sat there with the trembling page in his hand, his throat locked tight, and he did the only thing that all his wealth and power could do in that moment. He reached across the table, took her small, calloused hand firmly and warmly in his own, then spoke in a voice rough with emotion, one word at a time. Listen to me, Adeline. You didn't kill your mother that night. You were the bravest child in the world, running barefoot through winter to save the person you loved, and the world that closed its doors to you that night was guilty, not you. And your cry was never useless. It was waiting. It waited all those years to save a life on that exact afternoon, my life. And I promise you, on the life you saved from this moment forward, every time you raise your voice, this world will have to answer. The attic remained silent for a long while after those pages, with only the steady turning of the dryers below and the first drops of rain beginning to patter against the metal roof. Then Ronan released her hand, rose, and walked to the window overlooking the rain-slicked street glowing with reflected lights, and when he spoke, his voice was unlike anything she had heard from him before. It wasn't the voice of a crime lord giving orders or of a cold man calculating his next move. It was low and slow, like someone stirring through ashes that had lain undisturbed for far too many years. You showed me your wound, he said, his eyes still fixed on the curtain of rain, so it's only fair that you see mine, the one no one in this entire city even knows exists. He told her without turning around, as though keeping his back to her was the only way the words could escape. That long ago he hadn't risen alone, that he had a younger cousin named Finch, the son of the aunt who had taken Ronan in after his mother died. The two boys had grown up together on the docks, sharing every stale loaf of bread and every beating life handed them. Finch was younger, believed in Ronan the way a child believed in the sky, and followed him everywhere, always calling him Brother Roe. When Ronan began building his first dealings in the underworld, Finch was the one who stood beside him, grinning from ear to ear and saying that someday, when Ronan became king of the harbor, all he wanted was to be the man who guarded the gate. Ronan fell silent for a long time, his fingers tightening around the windowsill. Then he continued, saying that as their business grew, there was an uncle in the family whom both he and Finch revered like a father, the man who had taught Ronan his first moves in the hidden marketplace of the city. Ronan had trusted that uncle with the unguarded faith of an orphaned boy starving for a home, trusted him so completely that when Finch came rushing to him one night, breathless and frightened, saying he had overheard something wrong, that their uncle seemed to be making secret deals with men from the north, that Brother Roe needed to be careful, Ronan did the thing he would spend the rest of his life paying for. He dismissed him, he laughed. He scolded the boy for listening to rumors and suspecting his own family. And then, God help him, he even repeated the warning to the uncle himself as though it were some childish joke. 3 days later, Ronan said, and here his voice cracked along a fault line no amount of power could ever mend, they told me Finch had been killed at the docks. A rainy night. A slip, deep water. The file was closed with 2 words, an accident, as neatly as they closed the kitchen assistant's file now. And that uncle held me at the funeral, cried on my shoulder, then 6 months later handed both Eastern docks over to the Northern men and disappeared. It took me years to become powerful enough to understand everything that had happened that night, and by the time I did, There was nothing left to do except keep living with it. Finch didn't die because he slipped. He died because he raised his voice to warn me. And the one person in the world who could have saved him, me, covered his ears. He turned away from the window, and Adeline saw something on that cold, hardened face she had never seen before. The eyes of the crime lord who ruled the port city were red. So do you understand now, Adeline? That afternoon behind the flower planter, when a woman I barely knew caught my sleeve and risked everything to warn me, who do you think I saw? I saw Finch. I saw the chance life had given me to do over the thing I had done wrong, to listen this time, to believe this time, to protect the person brave enough to speak, instead of leaving them to die alone by the docks. You saved my life once, but you don't know that you were saving me a second time, saving the part of me that died with that boy on that rainy night. Adeline sat without moving, tears sliding down her face once more without a sound. Then she picked up the pencil and wrote a single short line. It seems the two of us are alike. You carry the boy standing in the rain by the docks, and I carry the child running barefoot through the hallway. We have both spent all these years carrying a single night that can never be repaired. Ronan read the words and nodded slowly, and as he sat down across from her again, a thought suddenly crossed his mind and stopped him halfway. He looked at her, his head tilting slightly as though trying to follow a faint thread through his memory. Then he said, half asking and half speaking to himself, "Strange. That apartment block on the outskirts you described. Back when I was running small shipments, I passed through that district all winter. And for some reason, ever since you started telling me, I keep seeing a brown-haired little girl standing at the top of a stairwell in some tenement singing. People called her something like the Sparrow, I think. But never mind. It was too long ago. My tired memory is probably inventing things to comfort us both." He let the thought end there and didn't pursue it, and Adeline didn't ask anything more, but for one brief moment, the two people sitting beneath that yellow light looked at each other as though they were staring at a door standing slightly open onto the past. Neither of them dared push it wider. They only allowed the wind from some distant winter to pass through the narrow gap. Then Ronan drew a long breath, placed both hands on the table, and his voice became steady again. "But the past can wait. They make their move tomorrow night, which means tonight we close the trap. And this time, Adeline, no one is going to die for daring to raise their voice. I swear it." The final 2 days before the weekend passed inside the mansion like the most ordinary 2 days in the world. And that was Ronan Marsh's masterpiece. He rose at the same hour as always, drank black coffee without sugar beside the morning newspaper, as he had done every morning for years, praised the grilled fish from the kitchen with the exact words he always used, kissed Celeste's hair before entering his study, and frowned at precisely the right moment when she spoke about household expenses. He didn't alter even the smallest habit, because he knew he was performing for the most discerning audience imaginable, and on the second evening, seated at the dinner table, he cast the final piece of bait in the weary voice of a busy man, saying that early on the weekend morning, he would have to go down to the docks to sign for a major shipment from an overseas partner, leaving early and returning by noon, a deadly dull obligation, but one that couldn't be postponed. He saw the hand holding Celeste's knife pause for half a heartbeat, before she smiled and said that she would have the kitchen prepare his favorite dish for lunch when he returned, and that half heartbeat told him everything he needed to know. Meanwhile, in the back room of the tavern hidden in the stone alley, the battlefield was being constructed one brick at a time. June spread a map of the harbor tunnels across the table, and that night another man joined them, Inspector Marlowe of the Major Crimes Unit, a quiet man with salt and pepper hair, whose relationship Bishop had cultivated discreetly over many years with the only currency Marlowe would accept, the truth about men the law couldn't reach. He listened to the entire file on Sloane, the two cities, and the nameless woman lying in the morgue, then tapped one finger against the advisor's photograph and said dryly that a man like this needed his handcuffs, double-locked, that he would have to catch him in the act with every man and every weapon present, if they wanted to ensure that no lawyer could ever pry him free. And so the plan took shape. Ronan's car would travel the usual route at the usual time and enter the tunnel like an obedient target, while surrounding Sloane's trap would be another, larger trap. Marlowe's officers would pose as maintenance workers. Raff's men would seal both ends of the tunnel. June would control the electronic eyes and ears. Every part would mesh with the next like the gears of a clock, and that very night, the clock nearly shattered. Ever since Bishop's identification code appeared in the dispatch record, June, the woman who never slept, had quietly cast a listening net around every name within the trusted circle, not because she suspected them all, but because her profession didn't allow her to give trust away for nothing. Near midnight, that net trembled. An encrypted message was transmitted from a telephone that existed in no official record, its brief contents cold enough to raise the hair on the skin. The target is going to the docks on the weekend morning as planned, but be careful. The old man and the information woman keep holding private meetings. Something smells wrong. June traced the transmitting device in moments, and it was resting inside the coat pocket of Colm, Bishop's distant young relative, the clever youngest member of their circle, the man who had sat at their table and heard half the plan. The back room of the tavern turned cold as ice that night when June placed the evidence before the two men. Ronan merely tightened his fist, but Bishop seemed to age 10 years in a single moment. The old man collapsed into his chair, his trembling hands covering his face as he murmured that he had brought the boy into their home, that the boy had eaten at his table. Dear God. Every piece suddenly locked into place with merciless clarity. Bishop's identification code, which had been used to send Raph away on false leave, hadn't been stolen from a distance. It had been copied by the nephew who entered and left Bishop's office as though it were his own home. The cruel twist of fate was that it had used the old man's innocent trust as a cloak for the traitor, and Ronan, watching his aging mentor bow beneath the weight of it, understood that fate had just returned something precious to him. He stepped forward, placed a hand on Bishop's shoulder, and said softly, "Lift your head, Uncle. I owe you an apology for the night I said I wasn't asking." The old man looked up with reddened eyes, and the two men regarded each other as every fracture from the past several days closed, without the need for another word. The only question left was what to do. Arresting Colm immediately would alert Sloane. Allowing him to continue unchecked might destroy the trap. Ronan chose the only move that could turn the danger into a weapon. They would transform the enemy informant into a channel for false intelligence. The following morning, Raph called Colm and assigned him work with the same trusting voice as always, casually allowing him to learn that the boss's trip to the docks had been moved from early morning to late afternoon because the overseas partner had delayed the meeting. Just as June predicted, less than half an hour later, the listening net trembled again. Colm reported that false time to his master, which meant that from that moment forward, Sloane rushed his men to position themselves for a morning trap, unaware that Marlowe's police force was already waiting to ambush them first, leaving Sloane completely defenseless when the real operation took place, and the hunters would reach the meeting place half a day later than their prey, without ever realizing that they were the ones being hunted. On the final night before the operation, Ronan stood alone beside the bedroom window in the mansion, looking down at the courtyard, where the kitchen lights cast their familiar strip of gold, where a slender figure continued working diligently, as though there were no frightening tomorrow waiting beyond the darkness, and he whispered to himself the final words of a commander before battle. "Sleep well, little sparrow. When the sun rises tomorrow, this cage will break." The fateful morning arrived clear and cold, the first light of day spreading like honey across the tiled roofs of the estate, as though heaven and earth had no idea that beneath that sweetness, blades of steel were waiting for one another. Ronan came downstairs at the same hour as always, dressed in a dark suit and carrying his familiar leather briefcase, and Celeste was waiting for him in the foyer, with coffee prepared exactly the way he liked it. She straightened his tie with the gentle fingers that had done the same thing on 100 mornings, looked him over once, then smiled, a smile beautiful enough to make the heart ache, and said in her clearest voice, "Be careful on the road, my love. Come home early when you're finished. I'll be waiting for you at lunch." There wasn't a single false word in the sentence. Only its meaning was false, a death sentence read aloud in the voice of love. Ronan looked into her eyes for one heartbeat longer than usual, carving into his memory the final image of the woman to whom he had once intended to give the rest of his life, then kissed her forehead and said, "Yes, wait for me." He turned and walked toward the door, knowing he had just spoken a farewell that only one of them understood. Outside on the steps, the polished black car was already waiting, and beside the open door stood Raph in his driver's suit. his face as calm as an old stone beside the sea. When Ronan approached, the older driver reached out to open the door wider, and in that moment his sleeve slipped back, revealing the battered steel watch on his left wrist, catching the morning sun, the small object whose absence had saved a life that afternoon, now resting exactly where it belonged like a silent declaration that the proper order of the world was returning. Ronan looked at the watch, then at Raph. Neither man spoke, only a brief nod, shorter than a breath, passed between them, but within that nod was an entire vow. Ronan stepped into the car and the door closed as softly as the final move in a game of chess. The vehicle rolled through the iron gates, leaving the estate standing motionless in the sunlight, and at the second-floor window, behind the sheer curtains, Celeste watched until the car vanished, completely beyond the end of the hill. Then she drew out her phone and typed a short message. The fish has left the harbor, right on time. Across the city in a room overlooking the docks, Sloane read the message with an unhurried smile. He wasn't concerned. According to Colm's information, the net didn't need to be cast until late afternoon. To him, that morning was only the opening movement, time for the prey to swim freely before the trap closed. He sipped his coffee, never imagining that he was drinking it during the final hours of freedom he would ever know. Inside the car, the air was thick as oil. Ronan sat in the back with a file lying half open across his knees. Though his eyes didn't read a single line, he could hear every turn of the tires against the pavement. The morning city drifted past the windows like a film playing in slow motion. Food stalls setting out their goods, children with school bags skipping toward class, a man watering flowers outside his front door. An entire innocent and ordinary world, unaware that it had become the backdrop for a battle. Ronan suddenly felt the strange loneliness of that moment with painful clarity, moving among humanity, while carrying a secret of life and death that couldn't be shared with anyone. Then Raph's voice came from the driver's seat, low and even, as though he were reading the weather. "Sir, we have company behind us. Ash-colored car, 2 men. They've been following since the fish market intersection, keeping 3 cars back. Changing lanes whenever we do." Ronan didn't turn around. He only asked quietly, "Are you certain?" Raph answered with the experience of a lifetime spent driving men who were being hunted. Ordinary drivers don't change lanes that way. They're moving like men watching, not men traveling. Then he spoke into the small microphone hidden beneath his collar. "June, do you see them?" Her alert voice came through both men's earpieces from the operations room. "I see them. The license plates are false, but they can't falsify the vehicle frame. It's on the list of cars entering and leaving the northern warehouse that I tracked last week. They belong to Sloane. But there's something strange, gentlemen. According to the information we fed Colm, they shouldn't have any reason to follow you this morning unless—" June stopped halfway through the sentence, and that unfinished thought made the temperature inside the car fall several degrees. Unless Sloane was more cautious than any of them had calculated, unless he never fully trusted any source, not even his own man. Unless the old spider had still sent out 1 strand of silk that morning to keep watch over his prey, just to be certain. And if that ash-colored car detected even the smallest sign of the trap waiting at the tunnel entrance, 1 call from them would destroy everything. Ronan looked straight ahead, where at the end of the coastal avenue, the mouth of the tunnel cut through the rocky mountain toward the harbor had appeared like a deep black eye opening within a wall of sunlit stone. Every turn of the wheels brought it closer, and Ronan spoke softly, calm as ice while a violent current surged beneath the surface. "Raph, maintain speed. June, alert Marlowe in every position. We have uninvited guests coming with us." Scenario 2, around the tunnel, every member of the invisible force drew the same breath and held it, because they all understood that from that moment forward, there was no road back for any of them. The black car slid into the body of the tunnel, and the morning sunlight was severed behind it as cleanly as if cut by a pair of shears, leaving only the sickly yellow pools of light stretching one after another beneath the stone vault, and the engine's rumble echoing against the walls like the breathing of the mountain itself. Scenario 2 went into motion from the very first second. At the bend in the middle of the tunnel, a maintenance vehicle with warning lights flashing had already been parked across half the lane, while several men in reflective jackets busied themselves around the cover of a utility shaft. Raph slowed gradually, exactly as any driver would have been forced to do, and when the ash-colored car behind them, had no choice but to slow as well. Entering completely into the section between the two bends where no one watching from either end of the tunnel could see, the entire mountain suddenly seemed to shift. The maintenance vehicle swung sideways and sealed the road ahead. A large box truck emerged from the bend behind them and blocked the rear. The men in reflective jackets all straightened at once, and not one of them looked like a maintenance worker anymore. Inspector Marlowe's voice exploded through the loudspeaker and thundered beneath the stone vault. "Police, turn off the engine. Both hands on the steering wheel. You are completely surrounded." Inside the ash-colored car, the two men froze for half a second, then did what desperate men always did. The passenger kicked open his door and lunged out, one hand plunging beneath his coat, but Marlowe's officers surged from the blind spot, behind a light pillar, and 3 armored figures crushed him against the tunnel floor, before whatever he carried beneath his coat could clear its holster. Metal struck the pavement with a dry crack and was kicked away by a heavy boot. The driver slammed the transmission into reverse in a frenzy, and the front of the ash-colored car crashed into the box truck with a violent impact that shook the entire tunnel. Glass poured down in a glittering shower, but the truck, many times heavier, merely sank a fraction under the blow like an old bull bitten by a mosquito. While the man was still shouting and fumbling with his phone, the door was ripped open, hands dragged him from the seat, and the telephone was torn from his grasp just as half the intended recipient's name appeared on the screen. June's voice came through the earpieces, tight as a drawn wire. "We have it. The call didn't go through." Clean, but at the very moment when everyone believed the trap had closed, the merciless law of every battle announced itself, that there was always one piece missing from every map. From the cab of a real maintenance vehicle parked in a service alcove not far away, a third figure absent from every one of June's lists sprang upright. They had been cautious enough to plant a man inside the tunnel the night before, disguised as a worker assigned to the overnight shift. He didn't attempt to escape. He did the worst thing possible. He turned toward the black car, where Ronan had just opened the door and stepped out at Marlowe's instruction, and raised his arm. Everything that followed happened in less than 2 heartbeats. Raf, the old driver, who had never stood more than 3 steps from his employer whenever they left a vehicle, hurled himself into the space between the two men, just as the sharp report of a gunshot tore through the tunnel. Marlowe's officers slammed the planted man to the ground an instant later, but Raf had already dropped to one knee on the pavement, his left hand clutching his right shoulder, and between those bony fingers, a dark stain was spreading slowly across the fabric of his suit. The old steel watch on his wrist struck the stone roadway with a small click. Ronan dropped beside the older driver faster than the emergency team rushing toward them, his hands supporting that broad back, and his voice, the voice that had commanded an entire underworld without ever trembling, broke now like the voice of a child. "Raf, look at me. You're not allowed to do this. I haven't given you permission to do this." Raf's stone-like face had gone pale, yet he still forced the corner of his mouth into a smile and whispered with all the stubborn loyalty of an entire lifetime, "Sir, it's only the shoulder. My late brother took a worse bullet than this back home and still survived it." "Don't look at me with that funeral face." The emergency team surged in and pulled them apart, and Marlowe seized Ronan by the shoulder and dragged him upright, forcing each word through clenched teeth as sirens began wailing beyond the mouth of the tunnel. "He's going to live. Listen to me. The 3 men here are only the claws. The head of the beast is sitting somewhere else drinking coffee. June, question those phones immediately." June, already breaking into the data over the hood of a car, shouted into the earpieces with news that turned everyone's blood cold. The final unsent message in the driver's phone wasn't meant for Sloan. It was a scheduled report. They're required to check in at the beginning of every hour, which means that in less than 15 minutes, when the report doesn't arrive, the spider will know the web has moved. And according to the location history I just extracted from this device, do you know where he is? The Hoatu Hotel. On the rooftop, less than a 10-minute drive from the harbor entrance of the tunnel, looking directly down over this entire route like an observation tower. He is never present at the scene. It was the same in the other 2 cases. He sits at a distance and watches other people die in his place. Ronan was already running toward the black car before June finished speaking. He tore open the door, and when Marlowe shouted that his team would handle it, Ronan turned for exactly 1 second, his ice-cold eyes burning with a fire that made even the seasoned inspector hesitate. "Then you and your team get into the car with me right now, Marlowe." He sat at a distance and watched my brother die. He watched the kitchen assistant die. Today will be the first day in his life that he has to watch something coming for him. The black car roared forward and raced toward the blinding light at the end of the descending tunnel, where the morning sea glittered with innocent beauty, as though it had never known that evil existed anywhere in the world. The pursuit to the Hoa 2 hotel ended not in a breathless chase, but in a cold, calculated move worthy of June Calloway, because while the black car was still racing along the coastal avenue, she did the one thing Sloane had never imagined anyone would dare do to him. She used the captured driver's own phone, typed the exact format of the scheduled report she had just decoded from the older messages. "Everything is proceeding according to plan. The fish has passed through the tunnel and reached the docks." Awaiting the afternoon hour, then pressed send exactly 1 minute before the deadline. And so, on the hotel rooftop, the old spider felt the thread of his web tremble with the same reassuring calm it carried every morning. He leisurely finished his coffee, leisurely arranged the papers inside his leather briefcase, and leisurely entered the elevator to descend to the lobby, before moving to the afternoon observation point according to schedule. When the elevator doors opened on the ground floor, what awaited him wasn't the glittering hotel lobby beneath its chandeliers, but a silent arc of people already standing in position. Marlowe occupied the center with the warrant in his hand. Ronan Marsh stood just behind the inspector's shoulder, and Sloane, the man who had directed so many deaths from rooms high above the ground, stopped halfway through a single step, only half a step. Then the mask of lifelong composure settled smoothly back into place. He even smiled and remarked that surely there must be some misunderstanding, gentlemen. But his eyes were fixed on Ronan, and for one brief moment, Ronan saw within those patient eyes of a creature that hunted at night something Sloane had never allowed anyone to witness: the absolute astonishment of a spider seeing its prey standing outside the web and staring back for the first time in its life. The handcuffs closed with 2 clicks, exactly as Marlowe had promised, and when they led him past, Ronan spoke only 1 sentence to him, so quietly that no one else could hear. "The people you turned into accidents had names, and beginning today, you'll have the rest of your life inside a narrow room to memorize every single one." At that very moment, across the city, vehicles without sirens slipped quietly through the iron gates of the seaside estate. Marlowe's second team spread through the great house according to June's map, and they found Celeste neither fleeing nor destroying documents, but sitting alone at the long dining table, with 2 places already set for lunch before her. She sat perfectly upright in her finest dress, like someone who had heard the wheels approaching from a great distance and decided she wouldn't allow herself to be arrested while running. When the investigators read the warrant, she merely nodded, rose without assistance, and extended both wrists before her. Throughout the walk across the grand foyer, past the paintings she had chosen to hang, past the enormous mirror before which she had admired herself on the day of her engagement, her face was neither defiant nor pleading, only strangely empty, like a house from which every piece of furniture had been removed. It wasn't until she reached the front steps, where a female investigator asked the final routine question, whether she had anything she wished to disclose at that moment, that Celeste stopped. She lifted her face toward the sky and looked across the sunlit courtyard, where she had once dreamed of holding her wedding, then spoke in a voice so calm it was chilling. "There is only one thing I want to say. He once told me this wasn't the first time he had done something like this. I thought he meant those 2 other cities, but that night he had been drinking more than usual. He laughed and said those 2 operations had only been assignments given to him for practice, that above him were people whose names neither I nor any of you would ever learn in our lifetimes. At the time, I thought he was boasting to make himself sound important." She paused for a moment, and for the first time, something resembling genuine fear rippled through her glass-like eyes. "Now that I think about it again, I'm no longer certain." Then she lowered her head and stepped into the vehicle, leaving those words suspended over the sunlit courtyard like a strand of smoke that refused to dissolve. The female investigator hurriedly recorded the statement in her notebook. When Marlowe later read the report, he only frowned and folded it closed. The case rested on evidence, and the case against Sloan and his accomplices was already so overwhelming that no drunken boast could change anything. But that night, after everything was over, Ronan sat beneath the lamp and read that line in the report for a long time. He didn't allow himself to follow the thought any further. He simply folded the paper in silence and told himself that every world had doors leading to deeper levels. But today, the door of his own family had finally been closed and secured, and that was enough for one lifetime. News that Raf was out of danger arrived late that afternoon. The bullet had passed through the soft tissue of his left shoulder without striking bone. The old driver woke in a stark white hospital room, and the first thing he did was reach for the steel watch someone had removed and placed neatly on the bedside cabinet. He fastened it around his wrist before finally agreeing to close his eyes and sleep again. At the seaside estate, after the last police vehicle had departed, a slender maid sank onto a stool in the silent kitchen, covering her face with both calloused hands. Her shoulders trembled for a long while. No one could tell whether she was crying or laughing. Perhaps she was doing both, because after all those years, for the first time in her life, her cry had been answered completely. The case came to a close more quickly than anyone had expected, because once the first door opened, the entire dark corridor behind it began to fill with light. The false driver was captured in a border town while trying to escape from the very people who had hired him, and when he realized that Sloan had intended to make him disappear forever, like a strand of silk that had served its purpose, he confessed every last detail. Colm broke apart during his first night in the interrogation room, revealing every payment he had received and every occasion on which he had secretly copied Uncle Bishop's identification codes. The cases in the other two cities were reopened, and the families who had been forced to swallow the word accident for so many years finally heard the law speak the true name of what had happened to their loved ones. Yet the immovable stone that crushed every possible defense, the evidence no lawyer working for Sloan could find a way around, came from the lined pages written in pencil by a maid who couldn't speak. Adeline's testimony, written over the course of several long sessions before the investigators, recorded every detail of the night beside the misted window with extraordinary precision, matching perfectly with the diagrams recovered from Sloan's safe, the telephone data, and the statements given by his accomplices. When Marlowe finally closed the thick file, he said something to June that she later repeated to Ronan. "I have done this work for nearly my entire life, and this is the first time the strongest evidence in a major case has come from the one person who cannot stand in court and speak a single word." In the days that followed, Ronan visited the hospital every afternoon, sitting beside Raf's bed peeling oranges, while the old driver complained that if his employer had so much free time, he ought to go back and deal with the docs. The two men bickered over small things like an aging father and son, and on the day Raf was discharged, Ronan handed him a set of documents that the driver had to read several times before he could believe what they said. They granted him ownership of a small house with a garden in the hills outside the city. The same house Raf had once casually admired while driving past it many years earlier, along with a position managing security and compensation so generous that the old man immediately protested and tried to return the papers. Ronan silenced every objection with a single sentence. "You put your shoulder in front of a bullet for me, so let me put mine beneath the rest of your life. Argue again and I'll be angry." Raf fell silent and turned toward the window for a long time, and when he finally looked back, the eyes of that stone-faced man were red. Then the greater changes began, quiet but decisive as the turning of the tide. Ronan summoned the heads of every branch of his business to the back room of the tavern in the stone alley, and he told them what many in the underworld would later call the most unimaginable transformation the port city had ever witnessed. He said he had spent half his life building an empire in darkness, and the price had been paid by good people forced either into graves or into lives shaped by fear. From that day forward, the organization would begin stepping into the light. The gray shipments would be replaced by legitimate contracts. The money sleeping in the shadows would be awakened to build vocational schools for the children of the docks and establish a fund for the families of working people. Anyone who couldn't follow the new path was free to leave with a fair share and without resentment. Bishop Cole sat in the corner of the table wearing his old wool coat and quietly removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. because the old man understood that he was witnessing the moment he had waited decades to see. The dock laborer from all those years ago had finally found his way home. At the house by the bay, meanwhile, a season of healing unfolded with every passing day. The little girl's operation was completely successful, and the small heart that had once struggled so desperately now beat steadily and strongly, like a young bird growing new feathers. Crayon cards covered in suns arrived regularly at an address the child knew only as belonging to a kind gentleman who was a friend of Sister Addie, and the sun in each new picture was larger than the one before. Her caregiver said the girl had recently begun standing beside the window and practicing the first hopping steps of her life, laughing so brightly that the sound carried across the water. The seaside mansion also began to transform in a way no one could quite name. It wasn't the stonework or the furniture that changed, but the air itself. Doors that had once remained tightly closed were opened to welcome the sea breeze. The servants stopped whispering behind one another's backs. The new housekeeper, a kind-hearted widow personally recommended by Bishop, prepared the finest stew in the region, and laughter finally dared to rise from the kitchen. Ronan, who had once regarded the house as merely a place to change his clothes between battles, developed a new habit. Each afternoon he went down to the kitchen, sat on the stool beside the stone counter, and drank the tea Adeline prepared with her own hands. They no longer needed much paper or many pencils. He had learned to read her eyes, and she had come to know every one of his habits. On some afternoons, they simply sat beside each other in silence, watching the sunlight slowly withdraw from the courtyard. Once, old Bishop passed the kitchen doorway, stopped to watch them for a long while, then murmured to himself as he continued toward the garden. He spent his entire life building walls around himself higher than mountains, and who would have imagined that the person who brought them down wouldn't need to say a single word. Several months later, when summer had ripened into gold across the port city, the garden of the seaside estate was no longer the garden it had once been. New flower beds, planted with varieties Adeline had chosen herself, bloomed brightly along the pathways, and in the corner overlooking the bay, a small wooden swing had been built for a brown-haired little girl, whose cheerful voice now filled the air every day. That afternoon, Ronan returned early from the docks and stood silently beside the low fence, watching a scene he wouldn't have dared dream of a year before. Adeline's younger sister, her cheeks rosy and her legs now strong enough to run, was hopping through chalk squares she had drawn across the courtyard, her clear laughter ringing through the garden like wind chimes, while Adeline sat on a nearby stone bench, needle and thread in hand as she mended a small dress, occasionally lifting her eyes to smile at her sister, a smile that now dared to bloom fully on a face that no longer remained bowed toward the ground. When the little girl saw him, she cried out happily and ran over to wrap both arms around the kind gentleman's leg, demanding that he watch how far she could jump now, then skipped away again. Ronan sat beside Adeline on the stone bench, and the two of them remained quietly together, as they had on so many afternoons, until the child came racing back from the far end of the garden and pressed a sheet of paper into his hand, still carrying the scent of colored pencil. "Keep this for me, please. I drew it for you." Then she vanished behind the flowering bushes. Ronan opened the paper, and his heart caught inside his chest. It was the old picture drawn again, still the house with the crooked chimney, still the enormous sun with rays stretching outward like long embracing arms. But this time there weren't two people standing in front of the house. There were three. The tallest figure stood in the middle, dressed in black that had been shaded with great care, one hand holding the hand of the person with brown hair, the other holding the hand of the smallest figure, who wore a smile that stretched from ear to ear. In the corner, the crooked childish sentence from years before had been rewritten into something new. "Addie and me and you, we have a home now." Ronan stared at the picture for a long time. The man who had remained standing through every storm the underworld could summon now sat with the sheet trembling in his hands, and when he turned toward Adeline, intending to say something, he found her looking at him, her gray eyes clear beneath the afternoon sun. She set down her needle and thread and drew one deep breath, like someone standing before a door that had remained closed for nearly an entire lifetime. Her lips moved, trembling, and from the deepest place within her, where the little sparrow from long ago had slept for far too many years, a voice rose for the first time, faintly hoarse and broken. yet whole and clear as a spring newly opened. Thank you for hearing me. That was all. 6 simple words she had traveled through a lifetime of storms to speak. And Ronan Marsh, the crime lord of the entire port city, couldn't find a single word in reply. He only reached out and took that calloused hand in his own, and there, in the sunlit garden with the sound of a child's laughter echoing around them, 2 people who had carried on their backs 2 dark nights that could never be repaired simply sat together, silent, peaceful, and healed. Her voice had returned not because of any miracle, but because at last there was someone who had truly listened. Just as his heart had returned to life not through power or money, but through a woman who had risked everything so that he might live. This story ends here, but its lesson remains for all of us. The greatest danger in life rarely comes from a stranger. More often, it wears a familiar face, sits at our table, and knows every one of our habits, so we must never judge a person's heart by a sweet exterior. And in the same way, we must never overlook the quiet, ordinary people around us, because courage doesn't come from status, wealth, or a loud voice. Sometimes the weakest and most silent person is the one brave enough to save an entire life. Every person we meet, no matter who they are or what work they do, deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with respect. Above all, never remain silent in the face of wrongdoing, because one voice raised at the right moment can change an entire destiny, while silence can sometimes demand the price of a whole lifetime. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it so that meaningful stories like this can reach even more people every day. And tell us, what did you feel about this story? About Adeline, about Ronan, about the voice that returned after so many years of silence? Please write your feelings from the deepest part of your heart in the comments. We truly hope to read every line you share, because you are the reason these stories continue to be told. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.